Well, thank you very much for staying with us on the AM show. Time now for us to get into our big stories. And the first one we're contemplating has to do with, yeah, you guessed it, LGBTQ plus and everything in between. The tussle between those two juggernauts, arms of government. The executive on the one hand and the legislative arm on the other. But where do we go from here? It's becoming a case of quid pro quo, tit for tat. Wakame with Timmy. And we proceed from there. But what could this lead to, this impasse, this standoff? We discussed those with our guests, starting with Bobby Benson. He's a lawyer. We'll also have a discussion with Dr. John Osai-Kwapong, a CDD fellow on governance, among others. But let me start with Bobby Benson, who joins the conversation. He's a lawyer. Bobby, good morning.
New Year.
Hello, Bobby Benson.
Hello, Benjamin. Good morning.
Good morning. I can hear you. I wish you could just speak up a little bit more for me. I'd be very, very grateful. It's been a while, my brother. Where have you been hiding?
That is why I wish you a Happy New Year.
Oh, I didn't hear that. Happy New Year to you too. This year you've hidden from me.
Well, I guess that we are all working towards a good start today.
I see.
I'm sure that I'll see you soon.
Okay. What do I take, Accra? I still wish we could get a bit more volume because I'm struggling to hear Bobby Benson clearly. But let's start from the very start. This entire fracas between the executive and the legislature on the back of the LGBTQI plus bill. Let's start with the bill in its current form. I'm sure you've seen a number of things. Some people have spoken about human rights. Others have said the whole bit about promotion and where it could lead us could be a very slippery slope. But let's start from the bill itself. What do you make of it in its current form?
I saw as the bill, it's a bit problematic, to be honest. I think that the legislature should have put them into two categories. Listen, if you say that our culture does not support people who have a certain sexual orientation, and you say that it is not something that it's something they do by choice, and it's a medical condition.
All right, Bobby, if you can hear me, it's still problematic hearing you, so just hold for me. Our technical team will try to get this sorted out so that we can come back to you. All apologies to you. Let me bring in Dr. John Osai-Kwapong, a CDD fellow on governance. Doc, good to have you.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Right. And actually, in today's Daily Graphic, something I'll reference you to, you've said a number of things about this standoff. But let's start with the latest developments that we've seen and everything in between. How do you feel about them? There's quite a tussle, wrangle, power play. How do you feel about it?
You know, as I mentioned in my Daily Graphic piece, it's quite interesting just to see how events have unfolded, culminating in the response from Parliament and all the things that the Speaker said. I feel that the biggest trigger was the letter from the presidency instructing Parliament not to attempt to transmit the legislation. I mean, our Constitution defines roles for both the executive, embodied in the president, and Parliament in the lawmaking process. And so Parliament has its job to do in terms of they have steps and processes to go through. Right. And once the legislation is passed, they have a duty to then send it off to the executive. And then it is up to the executive to decide what they want to do with a given piece of legislation that has come to them.
And let's just clarify that sometimes too, those bills could emanate from the executive. There are processes where the executive could also bring that to bear.
Precisely. And even if it emanates from the executive, again, once Parliament has dealt with it, they send it to the executive. And the Constitution makes provisions and gives specific powers to the president on what to do once he receives, a piece of legislation. In my opinion, I think that the instruction to Parliament not to attempt any transmission of the legislation was an executive overreach, right? Because again, Parliament cannot instruct the presidency, quote unquote, what to do, and vice versa. There is a reason why they are co-equal branches of government. There's a reason why there's separation of powers with specific rules and duties for each of those constitutional institutions or bodies.
So that letter from the executive secretary of the president was in poor taste.
Yes, I believe that is sort of what escalated this, impasse between what the president should do with the bill or not. Yes, the president has explained that there are certain extenuating circumstances which is informing his decision to hold off now in whether he wants to give his assent to the legislation or not. And that, for me, is fair. And it could have been left at that. But at the same time, I'm also sure that Parliament felt duty-bound, that those extenuating circumstances should not prevent it from transmitting the legislation to the presidency. So there is sort of a difference in how both arms of government are looking at, the processes and what needs to be done now that that legislation is passed. But now it's reached this crescendo where Parliament is also then, like you said in the beginning, and at some point, for me, the consequences is the relationship that ends up developing between those two arms of government. I'm one person who is not a big fan of politics that is adversarial in nature. And no matter what, the executive and the legislative arms need some amount of cooperation to address whatever key issues that the country faces. And I'm just hoping that at the end of the day, when this is resolved, it will be resolved in such a way that it does not leave a chilling effect on how the executive works with the legislative on important matters. The other thing I'm concerned about then is that you start also drawing the judiciary into some of these issues.
Because now, whichever way the ruling of the Supreme Court goes, one arm is going to feel aggrieved in a way. Those two arms have boxed the judiciary into a tight corner.
Precisely. And it's also not, for me, if there are things that can be resolved administratively, can be resolved through diplomacy, can be resolved through other means besides going to the judiciary, I encourage that, because there are certain issues that when you take it, particularly to the Supreme Court, right? So think about this. Let's say the Supreme Court rules, and says that, the bill is, unconstitutional, right? What precedent are you setting? That now before, a bill becomes law, you need the Supreme Court to weigh in before the president can give his or her assent? Or what if the Supreme Court rules that, the bill is, you add another layer of complexity. Yes, if Parliament oversteps or the presidency oversteps, no, I don't have an issue with asking the judiciary to sort of step in and give clarity, interpretation to, some powers that have been usurped or not. But how much are you going to draw the judiciary into battles between the executive and the Parliament, and what are the implications of that for the lawmaking process, or things like that? At this point, would we now start running on every little disagreement to the court? And you grind governance to a halt when you do that.
That is the precise position we find ourselves in. I'll come back to you shortly, because what you said also brings to mind, I don't know whether any of my guests this morning recalls. I stand corrected, right? I don't remember an instance in this Fourth Republic, again, I stand corrected, Bobby is on, you are on, where a bill was meant to be transmitted or attempted to be transmitted by the Clerk of Parliament for that person to be impeded on 3 occasions, basically prevented from transmitting the bill, suggesting in a way from the letter of the Executive Secretary to the President that the President is not in and you are tempted. I mean, I didn't get that. At no point have I heard anything of that sort. This is the first time. If you've heard of it, Dr. John Osai Kwapong, just confirm for me. Have you ever heard or seen such a situation before?
No, I haven't. And I also stand to be corrected if it has happened in the Fourth Republic. But since I have followed the Fourth Republic politics very closely, I do not recall an instance like this.
Thank you. Hold for me, Doc. Bobby Benson, welcome back.
Thank you, Ben. Is it better? Can you hear me?
I don't know what it is. It's a bit problematic. Let's try again. Can you hear me, Bobby Benson?
Yes, I can hear you, but can you hear me?
I can hear you. It's patchy. Okay, so my team tells me we'll try and reach out to you on a different connection and see whether that will be better. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about this. Let me bring in Dr. Rasheed Draman into the picture. You've also been talking about some of these developments. What is your initial reaction to this tussle between the legislative arm of government and the executive arm of government, which are meant to be co-equal, not subservient? What's your take?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, when I look at the unfolding drama, what it reminds me of is, situations that we have lived in our country where, the court is trying to serve sermons on individuals, and there is a struggle. They go to their house, they don't find them, they disappear, they make it very difficult, and so on. In the case of the executive and the legislature, I don't know if ever in our republic a bill is transmitted to the president in person. I think the bill or whatever communication there is normally will go from the office of parliament to the presidency. I mean, we don't need a president physically to be present before a document can be transmitted.
Were you surprised when you saw that in the statement? Did it shock you? Because I was taken aback.
Yes, it did indeed. I mean, it was quite shocking that we have a whole Jubilee House, and we know over the years, like you said, this has never happened in our republic. That, I mean, bills and communication after communication have been transmitted to the presidency. I mean, you don't need a president in the country or out of the country for communication to happen between the legislature and the executive. It just signals for me the deteriorating level of relationship between the two arms of government. Look, right from the beginning of this 8th Parliament, because of its character and nature, some of us have said over and over that we need, find a way to build bridges, to build consensus, not only between the majority and the minority in the House, but also between the executive and the legislature, given the fact that, this is not the 7th Parliament where we have Right Honorable Michael Kwe as Speaker of Parliament, who is from the same stock like the President. We have a completely different situation where, unlike, what we have seen before, the Speaker of Parliament can stand up to a President. If they are from the same party, they will have some conversation, and if there are any issues to be ironed out, these are ironed out.
And that was a point I was going to make shortly. I'll come back to you on that because another question on my mind is, again, would the Speaker of Parliament be behaving the way he is now if the NDC were to be in power? That's another conversation. But just hold for me,
Yes.
Dr. Draman. I need you to hold for me briefly. Let me bring in Bobby Benson, and respectfully, Dr. Draman and Dr. Osai-Kwapong, is because Bobby Benson has to move on to something else shortly. Okay, so I'm told we've lost Bobby Benson again. So this is proving problematic this morning, pretty problematic. Let me come back to you, Dr. Draman, on that point.
Yes, on which point?
On the point about, you were just wading into that. The Speaker.
Yes.
The Eighth Parliament is peculiar because we have a Speaker who is on the minority side. And, well, he's Speaker of Parliament. He shouldn't really take sides. But he comes from the minority stock. And you
Yes.
have the rest of the majority in there. And I was asking the question, do you also get the feeling that maybe if it were the NDC in power now and this thing had come up, maybe he would be acting differently?
Yes, I think so. I think so. However, knowing who the Right Honorable Speaker is, but if you recall, even when his party was in power and he was a senior person within the ranks of the party, there were occasions when he disagreed with the president and made it public. So there might be the likelihood that perhaps if he was pushed the way Parliament was pushed on this occasion, even if it was NDC that was in power, he would have maybe behaved the same. But
so you think on that he's a
in,
man of principle, and that very likely he would have stuck to his guns.
very likely. But if the NDC was in power, I'm sure there would have been so many other channels of having conversations with the president,
Right.
through all the structures of their party and so on. And maybe you wouldn't see, unless maybe those channels failed him, we wouldn't see this kind of situation blowing up, in our faces in public.
Let me ask you this. Looking at the tussle, and these are questions I'll pose to Dr. Osai-Kwapong as well. So, Doc, please take note as well. There is the moral question. E-levy, side by side with this bill. The e-levy within a period of 2 days, the 29th day of March, 30th day, transmission and everything going. By the 31st day, even with two suits in the Supreme Court, one from the minority seeking to stop the entirety of the process, and then by Bakavomawo to prevent the GRA from actually going ahead, actualizing the tax, the levy. Mr. President signed it within a period of 2 days. Now, you know what the Constitution says about the 20-plus day period, and if he's not in favor, vetoing it, transmitting back to Parliament, Parliament making amendments and communicating back to him, and the fact that they could, with two-thirds majority, also follow through on the process in certain ways. The moral question is there. Different situations, or is it a lack of candor? E-levy vis-a-vis the LGBTQ plus bill. And then again, the question of human rights that has come in. What do you make of it? Those two angles, what do you make of them?
I get the impression that it looks like we, in our governance kind of situation, sometimes we are not guided very much by maybe the core principles that are embodied in our constitution, but rather we are cherry picking, and I think that, Benjamin, our leaders have to be bold enough. If you disagree, say you disagree and say so, and let the processes take their course. That is the only way that we can build our democracy. There's nothing wrong with the president, strictly following the Constitution. He has a right under the Constitution to say, I will not sign this bill, and he has done that before. and the Constitution gives him the power to say why and so on. But a
But in this
situation,
instance, he's left us in limbo. He will not sign. He too, he will not veto it, and he's left the whole situation in limbo.
yeah, exactly so. And you see, it gives credence to what many are saying that, I mean, is it because of the pressure from the international community? Because we saw his finance minister just days after the bill was passed by Parliament, I mean, coming up with all the scenarios, the negative scenarios that could happen financially to our country if this bill is signed into law. So many are saying, is it the financial consideration? I mean, if it is, maybe the president should tell us, I mean, so that we don't, I mean, live in a situation where it looks like we are not, I mean, strictly following the constitution that has brought, I mean, all these leaders to power, and the constitution that they all swore to, to protect and to defend. And Jonathan, for me, the worrying part of it, as somebody who works very closely with our parliament and many other parliaments, look, over the years, for more than 25 years, we go around different places. I'm currently in Kenya.
Right.
This is, I mean, a very vibrant parliament here, and the issue of private members' bill is very, very common. It's a daily kind of affair. Over the years, you go to, I mean, many places, and they ask you, so how many private members' bills have been passed in your parliament? Zero. I mean, Ghana noted, I mean, with the stature that we have democratically, I mean, across the continent, and then we got to a point where in the seventh parliament, Right Honorable Makukwe, I mean, always, I mean, we have to give him a lot of credit, I mean, for being bold and for making sure that, he brought this power back to parliament. Regrettably, we see a situation in the case of this bill and in the case of the two other bills that the president rejected. We see a situation where Parliament is not united. I mean, I don't know whether they are not seeing that the power of the institution is being taken away. Because, look, a very, very bad precedent or precedents are being set. I mean, we can wake up and get another president after the next election, and if there's a bill that is not convenient to the president or the party,
Right.
they could simply ride on all these things that have happened in the eighth parliament.
Right. So it's a bad precedent, you say. The presidency is cherry picking, and it's a bad precedent. Just hold for me. Let me bring in Dr. Osai-Kwapong on those 2 points. The moral question, e-levy, Mr. President signed it with dispatch. Sharp, 2 days. That's what it took him. In this instance, he's decided to stay in the middle, leaving the entire process in limbo. Then there's the human rights question. I don't know whether you want to address that. If you do, I would have you look at those two, and then we'll take a quick look at whom you feel is on the higher moral ground, the speaker or the president. What's your take, Dr. Osai-Kwapong?
So on the first question of the e-levy, the suits that followed, the giving of the assent to that legislation and this one, I think I agree with Dr. Rasheed. That is where it makes individuals, including myself, wonder whether it is really about a pending suit that is therefore informing the withholding, of the assent or otherwise, or if it is the legislation in question. And I think that is what makes things even a little more difficult for our leaders when citizens look back and find inconsistency in behavior. Now, you don't have to treat every situation the same way. But having also said that, there is a certain application of principles and consistency in behavior that is expected. And so when there is a deviation, then it starts raising all of these questions about, well, is this really the case, or is it some other issue that is informing this? I've written about this. It would be in the Daily Graphic tomorrow. But in my opinion, I think the
No,
president
isn't that what is in the Daily Graphic today? Because I
No,
was
I
citing
actually
part
wrote
of that.
another one for tomorrow.
Oh, I see.
Right?
Right.
And I think that it's in my opinion, the president is in some kind of what I call a dilemma, right? He has to find a way to reconcile some of these external issues or challenges we may face because we are part of an international community, and that international community has signaled displeasure even at the fact that
But
Parliament has passed
but
the
even
bill.
on that point, Doc, in my blunt thoughts, I think last week or a fortnight from now, I made mention of the facts. If you look at the facts, countries in Africa, and I'm not necessarily saying we should go this or that way, but African countries that have bills on this, okay, LGBTQ laws, including Uganda, right? And the posturing of the World Bank and the IMF. We took a look, we incisively scrutinized it. And not much has changed in terms of what they are getting financially. Okay? In fact, their tranches still keep coming and all of that. So is that any basis really to fall back on? Because the fact shows that it doesn't hold water.
Right. But again, there's that consideration, and then there's also the internal politics over the issue, right? And the president has to find a way of reconciling, the two. I mean, at least that's my read, that perhaps then the suit that is pending in the Supreme Court and the basis, and using that as the basis for withholding assent or otherwise, maybe giving the president some time to sort of sort through all of this and reconcile it. But the question then becomes, if the court rules between now and when his presidency is over, if the court rules and says, yeah, the legislation is constitutional, Parliament did nothing wrong, does that mean that the president will then, give his assent to the bill or not? And that's what Dr. Rasheed is raising, which is, what is the president's position on this? Will he sign it just that he's waiting to see what the court does? Or even if the court says, yes, Parliament is on the right path, would he object to it? And that state of not knowing, when you leave gaps like that, then you leave others to fill in those gaps.
And our Constitution avoids those because there should be no vacuum. It should be a continuum, which is why even when a president, something happens, there are structures in place, like we saw from Atta Mills to Mahama. There are structures in place to ensure that there is no vacuum created. But gentlemen, we have 2 minutes to go. I want us to make the most of the time. You've not answered my question. Where do you lean more towards? The Speaker or Mr. President? The Speaker's positioning, okay, so we're also adjourning. We're not going to deal with your ministers and all of that. Then we'll also wait for the court to rule, and then we'll get back to it. Or the presidency. That's to both of you. And then again, what damage do you think this could do to our democracy? In 1 minute, I'll give the next minute to Dr. Draman, and we're gone. 2 questions for you.
Well, I like people to get along. I don't like adversarial politics. So I just hope that the presidency and Parliament, particularly the president and the Speaker, can resolve this in such a way that it doesn't do further damage to whatever relationship the executive and the legislature, do have. In terms of the damage to our democracy, the one thing I'm hoping we don't get to is, because our partisan edges are sharpening, and I worry that those sharpened partisan edges could start affecting a whole lot of things, even including the way the executive works with with Parliament. And I hope we can avoid that.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Osai Kwapong. I'll come to you, Dr. Rasheed Draman. You have the final bite on this matter, or we could say you have the final bite of the cherry, Dr. Rasheed Draman.
Well, I think, look, the damage has already been done. We are a country of tit for tat. I mean, just mark it. I mean, in the next parliament, you are going to start hearing, this was done in the 8th parliament, depending on who is in the majority and minority, this issue is going to resurface. I think in terms of the presidency, the president or the speaker, I would rather look at it this way. We have missed very important moments for building consensus and constructive relationship between the two arms of government. This is the moment. As we see in mature democracy, when the issue becomes very hot, that is when dialogue takes place. The presidency would have to give in some. The parliament speaker would have to give in some. And then they meet in the middle somewhere and find a way of perhaps reestablishing the relationship that should exist. Separation of powers does not mean absence of interdependence.
Right. Basically, concessions must be made. Thank you, Dr. Draman, as well, for joining the conversation. So we've had our guest, Dr. John Osai-Kwapong. He's a CDD Fellow on Governance. We also had, joining the conversation, Dr. Rasheed Draman, Executive Director, African Center for Parliamentary Affairs. Now, do stay with us. We still have a lot lined up for you. Definitely, we'll also be taking you to Lagos in Nigeria for that UBA event. Before that, though, we'll bring you much talk on the Help, Your Help, My Help, Your Help Foundation. Stick and stay. We'll be right back.